Hello. Sorry I can't be in class today. Also sorry because of this open house schedule, you guys are having your test pushed back. So this is our first lecture for our next unit. So if you read the homework for last night, you'll be adding to your notes, maybe just clarifying some things. There's really not a whole lot to cover today. It's just the basics of this first unit, and you can see at least you should have the title down in your notes somewhere, and you can see the title is Political Organization of Space. What that really means is just that we're going to talk about what makes a state, in other words, a country, challenges that countries face, both internal and international. So we're going to cover the basics of this unit today. Essentially, we're going to be covering the difference between a state and a nation. And if I were here in class, we'd be doing this stuff here in gray. But since I'm not, we'll skip it. Just make sure you got the title down. Let's move on. So as I mentioned, today we're going to really just talk about the difference between a state and a nation. Here in the U.S., we do things a bit backwards in terms of what we refer to a state as, or how we refer to a country. For us, states are things like Illinois or Texas. For everyone else, the word state actually means country. So you may ask then, what would another country refer to our states as? Well, they'd call our states states because we call them states, but generally if a country's been broken up into other pieces, they often call them provinces. It's not always true. Mexico has states as well inside it. But the general thing you should know if you're starting to get confused is that a state, when it comes to human geography, refers to a country, what we would call a country. A nation, then, we also use as a term for country, but in human geography also has a different meaning. For human geography, a nation is a group of people that have a common identity or common ethnic background. So we'll talk about this, but as I mentioned then, simple definition, a state is a country. States need a few things to be considered countries. First of all, they need some defined boundary. This probably seems pretty obvious. You need to have some sort of territory that you know and everyone knows is yours. Secondly, you need a permanent population. You can't just be somewhere where people pass through all the time. You need people living there permanently. You need to have what's called domestic and international sovereignty. Sovereignty is a fancy word that basically just means independence. So in the case of this bullet point, you're basically saying that countries need to have the ability to make decisions for domestic stuff that goes on at home inside their own borders, and stuff that has to do with what goes on outside their borders. So we're talking about trade policies with other countries, international agreements that they have that are not necessarily just trade-based. And finally, they need to have recognition by other states. If you, let's say, have a house and you draw a border around your house, you have a defined boundary, and you've lived there for decades, and you can make rules inside your house and possibly with people in other houses, this doesn't mean that you're a country because you are not recognized by other people. So this would just make you a crazy person who pretends they have their own country. You may think this is ridiculous. People have done this. This is what's called a micronation. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's a small country, even though, again, confusingly, nation doesn't mean that for human geography. So this is the micro country of Sealand. It's a structure built just off the coast of the UK. During World War II, this was an anti-aircraft gun station during World War II. Then a guy took it and made it into a country. At least he claims it's a country. It's got a bizarre history. You can see some of the people on it. There's a guy, that might be the guy right there. His name's Patty. It's been taken over once. The point is, he's done some things that make him a country, but it's not a country. First of all, it's not recognized by other states as a country. He may be able to make domestic policies, but he hasn't really made many international policies, if any. He may live there for a long time, but his boundary is also not agreed upon. The other problem with his territory is that it's man-made. No man-made things count as countries. So, the world is filled with weird things. This is just one of them. If you want to learn more about micronations or read up on Sealand, it's got a really funky history. Strange, interesting, extra credit if you overthrow the leaders of Sealand. It's been done before. As for a nation, the other definition for today is simply a group of people with common heritage in a place that they want sovereignty over. So this is a group of people that have a common identity and they want to have the ability to make their own policies. In some cases, these groups may already have their own country or their own state, but not always. We'll talk about that today. Having said that, there are many more nations in the world than there are states. States are countries. There's roughly 200 states or countries in the world, but potentially thousands of nations. We'll look at some examples of that today. Some of these states in the world are what are called nation states. It's almost what it sounds like now that you know these definitions. It's a nation of people that altogether form a single state. This is where the population has a common cultural heritage and their own state. There's really only two good examples of this for the entire world. Japan, as you may recall learning, is composed almost 100% of ethnic Japanese people, 99% Japanese. So it is a nation state. It's Japanese people that have their own country called Japan. Iceland, same deal. Almost completely Icelandic population in terms of its ethnic group, and they have their own country, Iceland, so they are a nation state. You can also combine some of these terms into versions that differ in meaning if you add prefixes or word stems like multi. A lot of states will actually have more than one nation, of course. So nation states like Japan and Iceland are quite rare. Instead, most countries are what we'd call multinational or multi-ethnic states. They're essentially the same thing. So as you can see with the word structure here, we've got multi, which of course means many, national, which we know is a group of people that have a common identity, same thing with ethnicity. So this is multiple groups of people within a single state. Lots of examples of this, but I'll give you a few. Canada is predominantly English speaking, but also has a lot of French Canadian people. And they have a population of native people. They are in a province called Nunavut. I'll show you a map of this in a minute. The United States, of course, is also multinational or multi-ethnic state. We have tons of different ethnic groups here. Many other examples around the world: Germany, Brazil, Nigeria. Here's a map of Nigeria that shows you just how much of a mess Nigeria is in terms of its ethnic groups. This map shows you that there's roughly 30 ethnic groups. Nigeria actually has somewhere around 500 different ethnic groups and 500 different languages. So as you can imagine, the more multinational or multi-ethnic your state is, the harder it is to govern that state because you're trying to bring together lots of different types of people under one government, and they may not always be able to get along or possibly even speak the same language. So Nigeria is really a good example of how multinational states can be really quite diverse. Most other countries in the world would fall under this category of multinational or multi-ethnic states. Since I told you I'd show you a map of Canada, here you can see, if you're not familiar with Canada, it's got a bunch of what we would call states, but what are really actually called provinces. And the one here that I'm circling, Quebec, is the French part of Canada. Most of the rest of these provinces are predominantly English Canadian, but we've got one up here called Nunavut. That's a native, predominantly native province. And also something I'll talk about in a second, a semi-autonomous region. So they've got some ability to make rules for themselves. Getting into this idea a bit further, often nations will have more groups or more territory than their border actually contains within them. If that doesn't make sense, I'll try and explain it a different way. If you have your nation of people that expands beyond your border, then you are a multi-state nation. You're a single nation of people, like let's say Germans, but you exist outside the border of Germany as well as within Germany. In other words, you're in many countries as a single group of people. Lots of examples of this in the world as well. For example, Russia has lots of Russian people inside it, but Russian people also live outside of Russia in nearby countries like Poland or Ukraine, for example. And maybe a more famous example would be Germany during World War II. If you're unfamiliar with the history of World War II and how it begins, you of course know that Hitler was the main cause. Hitler believed that Germany should expand, and he conquered other nearby countries that were predominantly German in terms of their ethnic background. And he believed that this was appropriate. Other politicians agreed with him, both inside and outside Germany, that he should be allowed to conquer these places and put them under the border of one country, Germany, because if the people were mostly German, then they would want to be part of Germany. So early on in his conquests, he was not opposed really by anybody, because his argument was he was just trying to make more of a nation state, trying to prevent his nation from being scattered among many states. He wanted to bring them all together under one government. Some nations also do have some independence, but they don't have their own state. This is what I mentioned on our last slide as what's called an autonomous region. If you think about your life as a teenager, you've got some autonomy. Your parents give you more and more freedom as you grow up, but you still can't make all your own choices. This is the same for an autonomous region. An autonomous region has some ability to make decisions for themselves, but not total independence, not total sovereignty. Two good examples of this: Native Americans in the U.S. have reservations, so they have the ability to make some decisions for themselves, and the U.S. government in some cases can't tell them what to do, but in most cases the U.S. government can tell them what to do, and this limits what Native Americans can do on their own. For example, Native Americans cannot have their own army, and as far as I know, they cannot make trade deals with other nations around the world. Tibet in China, which is sort of south or southwest China, also has some autonomy within China. Tibet revolted a few years ago. They wanted to become an independent country. China brought them back in forcefully and sort of as like a compromise gave them some freedoms so that they'd be less likely to revolt in the future. And the last thing we'll talk about today then is what's called a stateless nation. If you're breaking down these terms and you're starting to see what they mean and understand what these variations mean, this one makes sense, I think, pretty easily. It's a group of people, a nation, that doesn't have a state. So since I told you that there's thousands of nations in the world, but only a couple hundred states, a couple hundred countries, that means there have to be some people that simply just don't have their own country, their own state. So these are called stateless nations. The biggest one to know, especially for the AP test, is a group of people called Kurds. The Kurds in the Middle East are the largest stateless nation in the world. There's roughly 35 million Kurds, and they don't have their own country. They've talked about getting their own country. It's something that they're hoping to have. They've been fighting for this for at least a couple decades, and they would probably call it Kurdistan, but it doesn't exist. They are hoping to create a country, so until then, they are a stateless nation. Many other examples of this, especially in Europe, but we've got one in Spain called Catalan. Catalan people were fighting for their own government last year. This was in the news a lot, and the Spanish government violently brought them back from their independence movement and forced them to stay Spanish. But one day, perhaps, Catalan will become an independent country. Until these ethnically unique people feel like they are being mistreated and will have to fight for their rights to have their own sovereignty. Another group right nearby, on the border between Spain and France, is a group of people called Basques. One example we've already talked about, the Israel-Palestine conflict. Palestinians are obviously a group of people that don't have their own country. That's what the deal is with the whole Israel-Palestine conflict. There, at one point, was a territory called Palestine. It was not a country. It was run by Britain, and Palestinians were promised their own country. And instead, the promise was broken. Israel was created, and Palestinians lost their land. So they are also a big stateless nation. So the last couple things I'll show you here are just maps of the Kurds. You can see here we've got a map of Southwest Asia or the Middle East. All these brown splotches are where Kurds live generally. You can see they're spread over mostly 4 nations. You've got Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. And they're all over the borders here. So they are obviously without their own country and spread over many nations, or many countries, many states. So the Kurds are a great example of a stateless nation, and as I mentioned, the largest in the world. To give you an idea of how many there are in different areas, this map of the same area just shows you the number of people, roughly 35 million Kurds. Today, with the conflict going on in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, the Kurds are fighting ISIS and hoping that as part of this battle that they're fighting, they may be able to claim their own territory once everything is all said and done. But until then, they are one of many groups in the world that's called a stateless nation. Hope this made sense. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.